So, what are some of these data? Well, number one, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why anything at all exists? Well, typically atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, which call that assumption into question. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. For example, suppose you had an infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity, and I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all of the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. In each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any answer from 0 to infinity. For this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But in the real world, no such convention has any sway. Obviously, you can give away whatever coins you wish. This and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that past events, since they're not just ideas but are real, must be finite in number. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the very early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we are not able to provide a physical description of the first split second of the early universe. But the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of any such physical description of that moment. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state of the early universe, which some popularizers have misleadingly and inaccurately characterized as nothing, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. Even if our universe is just a tiny part of a so-called multiverse composed of many universes, their theorem requires that the multiverse itself must have a beginning. Now, of course, highly speculative scenarios like loop quantum gravity models, string models, even closed time-like curves have been proposed to try to avoid this absolute beginning. However, these models are fraught with problems, and the bottom line is that none of these theories, even if true, succeed in restoring an eternal past. At most, they just push the beginning back a step. But then the inevitable question arises: why did the universe come into being? what brought the universe into existence. Some intrepid atheists have said that the universe just popped into being without a cause. But surely that's metaphysically impossible. For such a conclusion is, in the words of the philosopher of science, Bernhard Kanitscheider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. Now, from the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical. Now, there are only two possible candidates that could possibly fit such a description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relationships. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. And therefore it follows logically that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind. And thus we're brought not merely to an uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
So how strong is Bill's case for the Christian God? I'll start with his favourite Kalam Cosmological Argument, the first part of which usually goes like this, and I'm presenting it slightly different from the way Bill has tonight. I prefer this way because it divides it into two stages, as we'll see. So we have whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. The argument is, of course, logically valid. Indeed, the conclusion follows trivially from the premises. But I'm not persuaded by either of the premises. Where is the evidence that whatever begins to exist has a cause? Certainly I have plenty of experience of change in the world and of new things being formed from old, as when a house is built or a plant grows from seed. And as far as I can tell, such changes that I have experienced are indeed causally governed. But these changes were all rearrangements of existing materials, and I've never experienced things coming into existence from nothing. So I cannot infer from my own experience that it is reasonable to expect creation from nothing, if it ever happens, to be causal in the same way. Moreover, such second-hand evidence as I do have that bears on the matter tells in the opposite direction. Quantum particles do apparently jump into and out of existence from nothing, but this behavior seems to be quite random. So the closest examples that I know of to creation ex nihilo are non-causal, and we have even more reason to doubt Bill's first premise. But things are even worse than this. For every change that I have experienced in the world has had, as far as I can tell, a physical cause. Even personal actions, as I said before, happen through physical intermediaries. All our evidence suggests that mental activity is dependent on brain activity. And in any case, I've never seen mere thought create a new object. So a more precise version of Bill's first premise would be, whatever begins to exist has a physical cause. However, if the universe is understood to include all physical things, then it seems obvious that it as a whole cannot have a physical cause. and I have excellent reason to doubt whether that principle can be valid as applied to the entire universe. This illustrates how problematic it can be to extend any principle from parts to wholes, a mistake which is sufficiently well known to have the name of the fallacy of composition. Every sheep in the farmer's flock has a mother, but it doesn't follow that the flock has a mother. And even if every physical thing has a cause, it does not follow that the entirety of physical things has a cause. This point is even more compelling in the wake of Einstein's general relativity, which implies that space and time are in some way part of the physical universe. The only sorts of causes that we can understand, including intelligent causes, act in time. If time does not exist without the physical universe, then it is hard to understand how the notion of causation can even apply to the creation of that universe. What about Bill's second premise, that the universe began to exist? To get clear what's being claimed here, we need to distinguish between our local universe, for which there is evidence of some sort of Big Bang about 13.7 billion years ago, and the global universe, by which I mean all physical things, whether in our local universe or elsewhere. Now, cosmologists speculate about the possibility of there being multiple universes. Indeed, there are a number of different theories that would predict this. They also speculate about oscillating, bubble, or evolving universes with multiple Big Bangs and so forth. So even if our local universe did indeed begin to exist in the Big Bang, it's entirely possible that it has a physical cause within the global universe. Moreover, there is no contradiction in supposing that the global universe is infinite in the past, even if the local universe is not. Bill standardly gives two reasons for thinking otherwise, one of them that infinities cannot be real. I shall return to that later. Bill's second standard reason for denying that the universe is infinite in the past appeals to physics, and the Borde, Guth and Millican theorem, which proves, making assumptions that seem reasonable, that any universe which is on average in expansion cannot be eternal in the past. An interesting result indeed, but it doesn't show anything like as much as Bill needs. In response to the question, does your theorem prove that the universe must have had a beginning? Alex Millican answers, no, but it proves that the expansion of the universe must have had a beginning. You can evade the theorem by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time. And there are theories, such as loop quantum cosmology and Harava gravity, that suggest precisely such a prior contraction before the Big Bang. In any case, the bottom line is that as things stand now, it's impossible to have any confidence in tracing our physical theories back to or beyond the Big Bang. They would imply an initial singularity, a point of infinite density, temperature, pressure, and curvature, which presumably on Bill's principles would be impossible anyway, since he says infinities aren't real. But more importantly, it seems that general relativity, on which all this is based, is inconsistent with quantum mechanics and breaks down at these infinitesimal scales. So all we know here is that our science cannot cope with it. Trying to draw any firm conclusion seems wishful thinking. This should not come as any surprise to anyone who has learned from my favourite philosopher, David Hume. When we look beyond human affairs, when we carry our speculations into the two eternities before and after the present state of things, into the creation and formation of the universe, the existence and properties of spirits, the universal spirit, infinite and incomprehensible, we must be far removed from the smallest tendency to skepticism, not to be apprehensive that we have here got quite beyond the reach of our faculties. Everything we know about modern physics suggests that at a very small and very large scale, our intuitive notions of what makes sense are very unreliable guides to truth. So Bill's attempts to apply everyday common sense principles about causation and about infinities to the beginning of the universe, when time gives out and our theories posit infinite singularities, strike me as completely unpersuasive, quite apart from the specific difficulties that I've already pointed out. Likewise, when he goes on to argue that if the physical universe has a cause, then this must be an immaterial mind. Recall that we have no evidence whatever that minds can exist in the absence of a physical substrate. So the idea that a mind might exist in the absence of the entire physical universe is complete speculation. It seems far more plausible to me to say that if, despite everything I've said, the physical universe has a non-physical cause, then that cause is likely to be something of a kind that we are completely unable to grasp, because it bears no relation to anything that we have experienced, neither a familiar physical object, nor an abstract entity, nor a mind. We are finite physical animals, evolved to live and perceive within a world of medium-sized objects. There is no reason whatever to suppose that our animal faculties will be adequate to fathom the origins or possibly the infinite history of worlds. As an analogy, imagine a dog or a mouse trying to understand the organization of a university. What chance would it have? Yet we are far closer in intellect to these animals, compared to that of an infinite God, than the workings of the entire universe are to a university.
Well, my first argument, if we can go back to my PowerPoint, it doesn't look, oops. Sorry, Peter.
Shall I help?
No, that's all right. My first argument was based on the origin of the universe. And I argued first that the universe began to exist. And here he says, well, but look, there are different multiverse scenarios, various models of the universe. I talked about those in my opening speech and explained that the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to those and shows a beginning of the universe. And then he says, but Vilenkin says that you can avoid the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem by positing a contraction prior to this one. Now, this is a statement from a letter of Vilenkin to Victor Stenger, which is very often quoted out of context by atheists. Let me read you the full context. Vilenkin says, you can evade the theorem by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time. This sounds as if there is nothing wrong with having a contraction prior to expansion. But the problem is that a contracting universe is highly unstable. Small perturbations would cause it to develop all sorts of messy singularities, so it would never make it to the expanding phase. So he says, if someone asks me whether or not the theorem I proved with Born-Guth implies that the universe had a beginning, I would say that the short answer is yes. If you are willing to get into subtleties, then the answer is no, but. That is to say, you've got the problem with the messy singularities that prevent re-expansion. So in fact, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does imply an absolute beginning of the universe. Dr. Millican says, but we need a quantum theory of gravity to describe the early universe. The Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of that. Vilenkin says, the remarkable thing about this theorem is its sweeping generality. We did not even assume that gravity is described by Einstein's equations. So if Einstein's gravity requires some modification, our conclusion will still hold. So it isn't affected by having a quantum gravity description. Here's Vilenkin's conclusion. It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So we've got good cosmological evidence that the universe began to exist, and Peter has yet to address my philosophical arguments against the infinity of the past. So we have good reason to think that the universe began to exist. Now, I suggest if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Here, Dr. Millican says, but we don't experience creation out of nothing. That's right, but rather we don't experience things coming into being without material causes. That's true. But if something cannot come into being without an efficient cause, it is even doubly impossible for it to come into being without an efficient cause and a material cause. This is even more absurd than something coming into being without an efficient cause. David Hume, so beloved to Professor Millican, said, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition that anything might arise without a cause. I only maintained that our certainty of the falsehood of that proposition proceeded neither from intuition nor demonstration, but from another source." Even someone like Hume recognized that it's absurd to think that something could pop into being with neither a material nor an efficient cause. Dr. Millican says, but quantum physics posits the origin of things out of nothing. Not at all. As I said in quantum physics, the vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy. It is not nothing. Baunoff-Konieczny, the philosopher of science, says, vacuum fluctuation models are far from being a spontaneous generation of everything from naught. But the origin of that embryonic bubble is really a causal process leading from a primordial substratum with a rich physical structure to a materialized substratum of the vacuum. This process includes that weak kind of causal dependence peculiar to every quantum mechanical process. So quantum physics is not an exception to the principle that if the universe began to exist, the universe has a cause. Finally, Dr. Millican says this commits the fallacy of composition, reasoning that because a property is held by a part of a thing, therefore it's held by the whole of thing. The argument isn't reasoning from composition. I'm not saying because every part of the universe has a cause, the whole universe has a cause. Rather, what I'm saying is that it's metaphysically absurd to think that things can pop into being out of non-being. Think of what non-being is. It has no powers. It has no properties. It has no potentialities. So how can the universe pop into being uncaused from literal non-being? That's clearly metaphysically impossible. It is far more plausible to think that the potentiality of the universe's existence lay in the power of God to create it. Professor Millican's final objection to the Kalam argument is that there is no such thing as an unembodied mind, so that it cannot be a mind. However, my argument is an argument for the existence of an unembodied mind. There must be a cause of the universe. It cannot be material, so it's either got to be an abstract object or an unembodied mind, and it can't be an abstract object. Besides that, I think we're acquainted with ourselves as immaterial persons. Reductive materialism doesn't work because material properties are not the same as mental properties. For example, the brain is not jubilant or sad. And epiphenomenalism, the view that the physical brain has mental properties, is incompatible with properties like self-identity over time, intentional states, freedom of the will, and mental causation. And so I think the best view of human beings is some sort of substance dualism interactionism, that we as immaterial agents are linked with physical bodies and have the ability to cause physical effects in the world. And similarly, God can cause physical effects in the world, much as my mind or soul can cause physical effects in my body. And Dr. Millican hasn't given any reason or argument to think that this is impossible. So I think that the origin of the universe argument still stands and provides good grounds for thinking that there is a transcendent, personal, immaterial creator of the universe.
I now want to say a word about the issue of infinity, which is one of the things that Bill took up in his rebuttal there. He said that I hadn't addressed his philosophical arguments against infinity. Now, of course, I accept that reasoning with infinities is a bit strange. It's odd to think that you can have two infinite sets of objects, like the set of odd numbers and the set of even numbers, which when added together yield a set which is exactly the same size as each of them. But there's no contradiction here, and indeed we know, since the work of Georg Cantor, that it's entirely possible to treat operations with infinities rationally and rigorously. Now suppose we take an infinite set, say all the integers counting upwards from 4, and we add 3 more elements, say the integers 1, 2, and 3. This yields another infinite set, the set of all positive integers. So infinity plus 3 equals infinity, and presumably infinity minus infinity equals 3, right? But as we know from the case of the odd numbers and the even numbers, infinity plus infinity equals infinity, which presumably means that infinity minus infinity equals infinity. So let's see those, they're up on the screen, together with a familiar arithmetical example to make clear what the pattern is. And the colours are intended to help there. There's nothing wrong with any of the additions here, but we can see that there's a problem, indeed an apparent contradiction, with the subtractions. Infinity minus infinity, apparently, cannot be given a consistent result. This is true, but absolutely nothing to worry about. Because all it means is that a certain equation, infinity plus what equals infinity, has more than one solution. When we say that 12 minus 7 equals 5, all we mean is that 5 is the unique solution to the equation 7 plus what equals 12. Where this sort of equation has more than one possible solution, we cannot properly talk about subtraction, because no unique value can be specified in that way. That's all. And there's absolutely nothing mysterious or contradictory about any of this. It's the same reason why you can't divide 0 by 0. The equation 0 times what equals 0 has lots of solutions. But that doesn't mean there's some fundamental problem with arithmetic using 0. It's just what you'd expect, given that 0 times anything yields the same result. Millican, the problem is that the contracting universe is unstable. Yes, but of course that depends on current physics. And I am saying that we have no reason whatever to be so terrifically confident about current physics. It's changing very quickly. The very fact that the Borde-Guth-Millican theorem is so recent ought to make us aware of that. The quantum vacuum, it's not nothing. No, I agree it's not nothing, but then it's the nearest we get. It was a nice trick to quote David Hume against me. I never asserted so absurd a proposition that something can come into existence without a cause. No, indeed. And I don't think he did assert that. But Hume actually, this is one of the places where Hume nods. Hume is a determinist, but he hasn't got a good reason for his determinism. I published a paper last year actually arguing exactly that. He's wrong. On his own principles, he ought to be open to indeterminism. But he isn't, and I think he's just inheriting the prejudices of the time. The point I'm making is that we don't have any reason for this claim that nothing can come into existence without a cause, except from our experience. And the nearest we get in our experience to things coming into existence without a cause, is in the quantum vacuum. All right, it may not be a perfect vacuum. It's the nearest we've got. So where is your evidence that nothing can come into existence without a cause? Abstract object or disembodied mind, I said, I don't see any basis for the assumption that those are the only options. There may be all sorts of things we've never thought of. I agree that mental properties aren't physical properties and that epiphenomenalism is incorrect, but I don't see that as a problem at all. A computer has algorithmic properties as well as physical properties. It doesn't mean there has to be some immaterial substance in the computer.
So do we have good reasons to think that theism is true? Let's talk first about the origin of the universe. First, we saw philosophical and scientific evidence that the universe began to exist. With regard to the philosophical argument, Dr. Millican says that infinity minus infinity is not defined in transfinite arithmetic. There's more than one solution to the equation. And that is precisely the problem when you try to translate this into the real world. You can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to subtract infinity from infinity, but you can't stop someone from taking away a certain number of coins. And the contradiction is that you have identical quantities, you subtract identical quantities, and you come up with non-identical results. And it needs to be understood, infinity in this case is not that sideways lazy 8, it's the number aleph null, which is a number. It is the cardinal number of infinity, and it would be identical minus identicals yields non-identicals, and I submit in reality that's absurd. As for 0, I think 0 is very problematic, frankly. I mean, suppose someone said, there's an elephant in the quad, and I said, well, I don't see any elephant in the quad. He says, well, there is an elephant in the quad, and its number is 0. Well, I think that's very problematic. I don't think there is such a thing as 0. It means just the absence of something. Now, as for the argument for the physical evidence for the beginning of the universe, Here, Dr. Millican says this depends on current physics. Well, of course it does, but that just is to admit my point, that the evidence of current physics supports the fact of the beginning of the universe. Moreover, this is widely accepted by physicists today. According to James Sinclair, a physicist on the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin singularity theorem is now widely accepted within the physics community. As of this writing, 2009, it has gone largely unchallenged. So the evidence of contemporary cosmology supports my premise that the universe began to exist. Now, if the universe began to exist, then surely it has a cause. And here Dr. Millican didn't really respond to my point that the vacuum is not nothing, that if something can't come into being without an efficient cause, it's doubly absurd for it to come into being without an efficient or a material cause. Can there be an unembodied mind that created the universe? Well, remember, I suggested that we are minds that are connected with bodies, that we are immaterial substances that produce effects in our physical bodies. And here, unless I misunderstood you, Peter, I thought he said epiphenomenalism is a wreck. I thought that was what he said, and I would agree with that. But if that's the case, then I don't see that there's any argument that's been given tonight against the substance dualist view of human being, that we are immaterial substances conjoined with bodies, and therefore I see no problem in thinking that there might be an immaterial spiritual consciousness or mind, God, who created the universe. Indeed, I've given an argument for that conclusion based on the origin of the universe.
One thing that I found much too quick was the claim that if epiphenomenalism is false, then substance dualism must be true. That is, we must be an amalgam of mind and body where mind is a separate substance. Now, I haven't got statistics on that, but I know that the vast majority of philosophers think that is wrong, but very few are epiphenomenalists, I think. So the consensus of professional philosophers, I think, is very much against Bill here. I didn't anticipate that issue, so I didn't check, but
First, the origin of the universe. We've seen philosophical arguments and physical arguments for the beginning of the universe. We've also seen that if the universe began to exist, had an absolute beginning, that it surely must have had a transcendent cause that brought it into being. And whether or not one wants to indict epiphenomenalism or not as a theory of mind, the point is that I can't think of anything that would fit the description of an immaterial, non-spatial, trans-temporal substance which could causally bring the universe into being apart from an unembodied mind.
Bill is very keen on appealing to what he can imagine. Now, the problem is that what we can imagine has proved to be a very unreliable guide. I mean, he has problems with the number 0. Yeah, but it's used all the time, and it's used very effectively, and many of us find no problem with it. Infinities, yes, well, they look difficult too. They used to be thought of as completely untamed until Cantor tamed them. Now, in those cases, we have logic and the avoidance of contradiction to guide us, and we can find that these things can be dealt with in a very coherent way. In other cases, like physics, we have to rely on experiment, on observation. Those are the only ways we can know what causes what. Bill continues to appeal to the claim that something can't come into existence without an efficient cause. I've pointed out that he hasn't actually got any reason for making that claim. All right, the quantum vacuum is not nothing, but still, you haven't got any evidence with regard to nothing. And claiming it about the universe, well, there's no evidence for that. So modern physics, if it teaches us anything, teaches us that these kinds of instincts are not reliable guides. The only thing we can go on is scientific investigation, careful, critical investigation, not taking tradition for granted. Just look at those empty hundreds of years when nothing changed. That's what happens if you rely all the time on tradition.
If the universe needs a cause, doesn't God? What causes God?
Remember the argument that I presented, the universe began to exist. If the universe began to exist, then it has a transcendent cause, therefore the universe has a transcendent cause. The way I usually formulate this argument is the way Peter addressed it. I usually say whatever begins to exist has a cause. That is to say, things don't come into being without causes. But if something never began to exist, if it's eternal, then I don't see any reason to think that it needs a cause. And this isn't special pleading for God. This is what the atheist has in the past always said about the universe. It is just eternal and uncaused. But that, I think, is now untenable in light of modern physics and the philosophical arguments I gave. So God, I would say, is simply a metaphysically necessary, uncaused, eternal being.
Does that not perhaps strike some problems with your arguments about infinity?
Yes, it would if I thought that God existed through a backwards, infinite series of past events. It would apply to the life of God as well as to physical events. And therefore, the conclusion I draw, and the one that is drawn by traditional proponents of this argument, like Al-Ghazali, the medieval Muslim theologian, is that time had a beginning, and that the boundary, as it were, of time is the eternal or the timeless state of God, so that God is timeless without creation. God would be analogous to the cosmological singularity which marks the beginning of the universe in the Standard Model. It is not a point in space-time, it's a boundary of time. And that's what I would say similarly of God's eternity.
Peter?
Yeah. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. I mean, I think there's something a little bit sneaky here in that it can look as though the premise is being cooked up in order to suit God. But I do feel that the question asked makes a good point. Anything that you can say about God, the onus is on the theist to explain why you can't say the same about the universe. If God can be eternal, why can't the universe? If God can exist without a cause, why can't the universe? I also want to make this point that all of our knowledge of any of this stuff, our own intuitions are not reliable. We have to rely on experience. And we don't have any experience of things coming into existence ex nihilo, either with or without a cause, except possibly quantum particles. So I don't see how we can possibly know this. Again, experience tells us that minds are dependent on bodies. And I'm not prejudging the question here about, immortal life and all that, but just think about evolution. Okay, I mean, I take it the fine-tuning argument naturally goes along with support for the theory of evolution. Because if you're just going to create intelligent creatures, just go and do it, right? You don't need to go through all this rigmarole of 13 billion years. Now, in an evolutionary theory, you've got mind arising eventually when we do, but it's coming from body. When babies are born, the body's there first, then the mind comes. Whereas the theistic theory says that in this one unique case, the mind comes first and can exist without the body, and we've got no evidence for that at all.
Question from Paul Birtwell. If an infinite regress of past events is both mathematically and logistically impossible, what is the ultimate cause of everything, if not God?
I think God is the ultimate cause of everything.
I see no argument, first of all, why there has to be an ultimate cause. I mean, it's plausible, but I don't claim. Look, my brain has evolved to deal with ordinary middle-sized objects in an environment very different actually from the environment now. Why should I suppose that I am able to plumb the mysteries of the universe? I mean, it's amazing how far we've got. It's absolutely incredible how clever we are at working out the mysteries of the universe with the aid of lots of very sophisticated machines, and by building on the shoulders of others over, well, in 4 centuries we've done remarkable things. But compare that with the 1600 years before then, when everything was dominated by religious belief.